So thank you all for joining us today for the Teaching in Person training series, using active learning in your class and assessing student learning workshop. Joining us today are Dr. Caitlin Clinnan, Assistant Professor and Director of Composition for the English Department, and Melissa Bowles-Terry, Director of the Faculty Center. Together, they're going to discuss how to incorporate active learning strategies into your classrooms and how to assess student learning. And now I'm going to hand it over to them to get us started.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm going to just start sharing the presentation here. Okay, and so welcome to our workshop. It's nice to see names of those people who joined us last week. I do want to point out that we have a Google folder available for you all at the bit link that Melissa also just posted in the chat, but it's bit.ly/teachinglogistics. And so we also used the same folder last week. So our slides for last week and our resources from last week are there, as well as these slides and resources that we'll be going over today. And so if you weren't with us last week, it's fine. You can go back and look at those materials, but you definitely don't have to have been in our session last week to experience today. So today, as mentioned, we're going to talk about active learning and assessing student learning. And although Melissa and I are presenting these two things discreetly, they're really interconnected. You really can't talk about active learning without talking about assessing student learning. And some of the ways that you assess student learning are through active learning strategies. So just keep that in mind, that there will be overlaps between our two presentations, and that goes back to our understanding of backward design, where we're thinking about what do we want students to learn, how are we going to know that students have learned that, and then how do we create activities that provide instruction for students to demonstrate that they have learned that skill. So today we've got a couple of things that we'll be working on, and we'll talk about different activities that you can use to engage students and meet those learning outcomes in a variety of classes, as well as some assessment techniques that you can apply to learn what students have learned so far. So active learning strategies. I'd like to start with an active learning strategy ourselves, and I'd like you to just take 2 minutes. And for those of you who were with us last week, this will be a bit of review for you. For those of you who are new joining us today, with backward design, we always start with, what is it that we want students to learn in our class? And I'm going to ask you to write a learning outcome for what students can learn in one class session, one of your classes, whether that's a 50 to 75-minute class, or if you're teaching a 3-hour long class. What do you want students to be able to do at the end of that session? So just take 2 minutes, and you can share your learning outcome in the chat if you like, or you can just keep it for yourself. If you're finding that you're struggling with writing your learning outcome, then I highly recommend that you go back to our slides from last week and some of the resources we shared then. We also have some information about how to tell if your learning outcome is appropriate for an entire course over 16 weeks, a unit, or a class session. So one meeting with your students. And so today we're focusing on active learning and integrating activities into our class. So that's why I asked you to start with, what do you want students to learn within one class meeting? So before we get into talking about what active learning is, maybe we'll start with thinking about what passive learning is. And here is, I think, a pretty interesting representation of passive learning. And so this is actually from an artist who was imagining what education would look like in the year 2000. And these were created as a series of postcards in the turn of the from 1890s to the early 1900s. And so we can see here that we have a professor in the corner who's obviously a white man, because of course, and dumping books of knowledge into the, again, male white students through this technology. And they are just sitting there passively, just looking blankly straight ahead as the information is passed into their brain from the expert to the student. And we can think about this as passive learning, or we can also think about it as Paulo Freire refers to it as the banking method, that there is an expert and education is a process of learning from the expert, absorbing all of their knowledge. The student knows nothing, the student has no life experience. They're all there to absorb what the instructor or the faculty member has to say. In contrast, active learning is the model that most education operates from these days, and it's defined as any instructional method that engages students in the learning process, so that students are doing meaningful learning activities and they are thinking about what they are doing. And I wanted to highlight the term meaningful here, because often, we get feedback from students, or we might receive feedback from students that they don't understand what it is that they're doing. They think that activities are just busy work, or that their homework is just busy work. And that's something for us as instructors to constantly reflect on. And if we go back to backward design and we're thinking about what is it that we want students to learn, and then we're creating opportunities for students to meet those outcomes through our activities, through our homework, through what we're doing in class time, students are less likely to think that it's busy work, because they'll be able to see the direct connections to what they're doing to what they should be learning. So it's not just about giving something students for the sake of giving them something, or for doing something that seems really cool but doesn't necessarily have a clear purpose. We want to make sure that they're meaningful learning activities. And so active learning, it shifts the emphasis in the classroom from the instructor, or what we might think of as the sage on the stage, the expert, and all the students are sitting around at the expert's feet, listening to them and absorbing their knowledge, to then the emphasis is on the student doing things. And so the instructor takes on a role more of guide on the side, helping to facilitate student learning, but ultimately it is the students who are responsible for doing and learning and creating knowledge. We also know that active learning helps students retain information and transfer this information into new contexts, because ideally we want students to take what they've learned in our class and apply it in future classes, or into their personal, their professional lives as well. You can also do active learning in any class size, whether you're teaching 10 students or 100 students or 1,000 students. You can do it in any delivery mode, so face-to-face, remote synchronous, or completely online asynchronous. You can do it with as little time. Typically active learning takes a little bit of time to set up, but you can do it in really low effort, low energy ways that just take 5 minutes or even 1 minute. Or you can have really elaborate setups that might take 90 minutes or more. And active learning can be used in any discipline. And then, one of the concerns that I often hear about including active learning in our classes, from instructors, is that it takes a lot of time, or that it's really complicated to set up some of these activities, or it creates like a mountain of extra grading for the instructor, or just a lot of work. And while that can be the case, that's not the goal of active learning. The goal is not to make a lot of extra work for the instructor. You can incorporate active learning in very small ways in your class, that doesn't create this extra work for you, that can be really impactful for your students with just 1 minute. And we'll talk about some of those strategies here in a bit. So just thinking about the process of, okay, well, I'm sold on active learning, but how do I do it now in my class? Again, start with those learning outcomes. So start with what you want students to learn in your class. And so that's the students will be able to, and I saw some examples of this pop in the chat, but some of the examples that I came up with as well, search an academic database using Boolean operators to determine the pH of a liquid, compare and contrast classical operant conditioning. And then once we know what it is that we want students to learn, we consider our acceptable evidence. What will we need? How will we know that students have learned what it is that we want them to learn? And so depending on what your learning outcome is, you might have different evidence. So you'll know that students are able to search an academic database if they complete the search and they find some sources. You'll know that they can determine the pH if they can use a litmus test or if they design an experiment. And so this acceptable evidence will be directly related to whatever your learning outcome is. And then we will provide students with a way to demonstrate their learning or to learn what it is that they need to learn. And so those are through our instruction and activities. So here is a spectrum of active learning activities. On the left, we have the simplest forms of active learning. And then as the line goes up to the right, it gets more complicated. And so we'll go over some of these strategies here in a second, but this gives you an idea of the range possible for active learning. And some of these active learning strategies will work better in particular disciplines or in particular delivery methods or with as much time as you have. But don't feel like you're always limited to the same type of active learning strategy. I know that was a question that came up last week during our session, just that the instructor felt like they were always defaulting to the same sort of activities. And that's not necessarily a problem, but if you want to try something else out, there's probably another way that you can structure your class time that won't take too much energy on your part, but can also bring some variety into your class. So some common structures for active learning. These are some of like the really low impact ways that they aren't too fancy, they aren't too complicated. I've done really complicated active learning activities that require weeks of preparation, and those are always great. But often these really small ways are the small, meaningful ways that will accumulate over time for students. So lecture, you can make it more active. So I think often there's a concern that with active learning that means that instructors can't lecture. And students sometimes need lecture. They need some information presented to them. But we can make lectures more active by just breaking them up a bit, by including pauses so that students can reflect, by asking students to summarize what they've learned so far, to present brief problems that ask them to apply what the lecture has introduced so far, even small discussions. Think, pair, share is another common active learning strategy that, and there are different ways that you can set this up as well, but it begins with a student individually thinking, maybe writing in response to a question. Then they get into a pair or a small group where they can discuss, and then you have a larger class discussion. And this is one way to also prep for a larger class discussion. I know instructors, nobody wants to, have the crickets, the silence after you ask a question. And so doing a think, pair, share is a way to warm your audience up, to warm the students up, that they have had a chance to share their ideas, to get some feedback, maybe refine those ideas before you have the larger class discussion. You can also do collaborative activities. I think this is what people tend to think of when they think of active learning. And so you might have students work in small groups to complete an activity. such as analyzing an image, some text, some data. You might ask them to prepare a debate. It really, again, depends on your discipline. And you can also assign group roles to ensure that everyone participates, and so that it's not just the same few students who are always speaking in class, who are always, doing all the work in the groups. And so some of the group roles might be that you have a spokesperson, so who will, present the group's discussion to the rest of the class. You might have a note taker. You can have someone who will play the devil's advocate. There are a variety of group roles that, again, depending on the activity in your discipline, might work a little bit better. Problem solving, such as having students respond to a real example, a case study, or a situation, so that they're responsible for applying the knowledge that they have developed. And this is often really exciting for students because we want them to get engaged with some of the thorny problems in our discipline. That's what's going to get students interested, and to create our future scientists or writers or psychologists. So bringing in some real world examples and letting them try to figure out what do they do about it. And then finally, like reflecting. So having students summarize what they've learned, thinking about how they'll connect what they've been doing in class to other situations, and also thinking about what they still need to learn. So here we're asking students to think about what they've been doing, developing some metacognition. So some of the concerns that I also hear are, okay, I teach a really large section. How do I do active learning? And to that, I would respond, use group work. You can break your 100, 200 person lecture into small 4 or 5 people groups. You can use all of these strategies with much smaller groups and then have a larger class discussion. I know a lot of people also use technology to get polls or surveys or clickers in their class to get some of that immediate feedback from students. And then even though we're talking about in-person teaching, I did want to mention online classes, since that's been a context that many of us have taught in and may teach in again in the future. And again, there's this, I think, assumption that all online teaching is just, here's a lecture, students watch it, and that's it. But online learning can be very active. And so using the chat feature, like what we've been using here, using breakout rooms, again, using polls or surveys to give a quick assessment to check understanding. You can use Google Docs or other tools like Padlet, which is a way for students to either anonymously comment. You can use discussion boards in your class, really incorporating a lot of peer-to-peer feedback. Or there are tools like Hypothesis that allow you to group annotate a document. So if you have a reading in your class, you can have students provide commentary on that document together. So in summary, lecture's not bad, just make sure that you try to make it more active and to include some more activities in your class.
All right, so as Caitlin said, there is a lot of overlap between active learning and assessment. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about regarding assessment are activities that you can do in your class that will help students learn a thing, but will also show you that students have learned that thing. So would you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. The idea here is just to be as authentic as possible. So how do you know if a person can ride a bike? You watch them ride it, right? So it's sort of the same idea with the learning outcomes that you've put in the chat here. If you want to know whether students can analyze the conventions of a literacy narrative in a given text, then you want them to do that and demonstrate themselves doing that. Maybe they do that by annotating the text. Maybe they do that by writing a paper or a reflection paper. The next outcome we have here in the chat is students will be able to compare their own life experience to the social ideas referenced in 3 articles and discuss the extent to which they've had similar experiences. So this is another, like, you've kind of laid out the assessment right there in the learning outcome. So you know exactly what you want to see students do, and then you'll know that they're able to do it. That's your assessment. And then the third outcome that you've provided as an example here, students will learn how to search for and critically read scholarly articles. Okay, to assess that, you say, well, how many articles do you want to see? See if they find them. And then how are they going to demonstrate that critical reading? Again, maybe it's annotation, maybe it's writing a response. But you already know basically like what is authentic assessment? It's seeing that students can do the thing that you want them to do. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a bit about classroom assessment techniques. So these are little things that you can do in class to check understanding. Caitlin and I are both cat people, FYI. So sometimes we call classroom assessment techniques CATs. And there is a whole body of literature on this topic. There is a very thick handbook by Angelo and Cross that is full of classroom assessment techniques that they've divided up by disciplines and levels of complexity and levels of preparation for instructors. So if that's something you want to check out, Lead Library has some copies. I have a copy in the faculty center that you are welcome to borrow. But classroom assessment techniques, you can also just search online and you will find lots of collections of these. I'm going to walk through a few today that might be helpful for you, but we are going to focus on classroom assessment techniques rather than like end of semester assignments, because here's the definition. Classroom assessment is learner-centered, it's formative, and it gives instructors a chance to find out what students are learning in the classroom and how well they're understanding it. So it's a total snapshot, just a moment in time to see what your students know and understand. We decided to focus on classroom assessment because right now in your graduate assistant life, this is probably what you have the most control of. Maybe you haven't designed the final assignment or exam that's going to see if students have learned everything that they were supposed to learn throughout the semester, but you may have control of this like classroom level stuff. So you can see what students know on any particular day. So that's what we mean by learner-centered. It's all about the student, about what they know in that moment. And formative is different from summative. So summative would be like the end of semester test or assignment. Formative is what's happening along the way and you're giving them feedback as they go. And yes, the text is Classroom Assessment Techniques by Angelo and Cross. So it's the book to check out. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a few simple classroom assessment techniques that I've used a lot and that might be helpful for you. And we're just going to sort of apply them to this content that we've been talking about last week and this week. So a background knowledge check is like a little bitty mini pre-test to find out what students know about a topic. And this might be a way that you start out a class or start out a unit or a module just to find out what students already know about the topic and to warm them up maybe and remind them what they do know. It's a way to get them into an idea before you even do any lecture or do any content presentation. So if I were doing a background knowledge check on the stuff that Caitlin and I have been teaching you the last couple of weeks, I might hand you the lesson planning template that we shared last week that's still in the folder that we shared, and ask you, what do you think about this lesson planning template? And you just choose A, B, or C. I'm not sure what this is. I have some idea what this is, or I have a clear idea what this is, and I can explain it to others, just to get a sense of like where the class is at, what people know so far. So if you're teaching, last time someone brought up like aseptic lab techniques or something, you could ask students, do you know what this is? Like any ideas about what aseptic is? I would be in the, I am not sure what this is, but just to find out what students know before you're getting started. So that's a background knowledge check. Easy to do in an online class or a face-to-face class. You can just have students, show you a 1, 2, or 3, with a hand, something like that. Oh, and it looks like Miranda has already shared 50 assessment techniques from the Angelo and Cross book, which is awesome. Okay, so that's background knowledge check. Let's go to the next one. Last week, I think we mentioned the minute paper, but not necessarily as an assessment technique. But this is a way to check student understanding and see what they know so far. So this is different from the background knowledge check, which you would likely do at the beginning of a class session or a module or a unit. The minute paper is something you do at the end. So once you've been through your class period or been through a unit, you can ask students, what are the two most significant things you learned during this session, and what questions remain uppermost? And then based on what they tell you about the most significant things, do those match up with your learning outcomes? Did they get what you were hoping they would get out of this, or did they get something totally new and different because they went off in a slightly different direction than you expected? That's good to know. That's something for you to note in your lesson template and say, all right, well, next time I will either need to focus more in this area, or you'll know that this particular lesson may go in a new direction and maybe you want to adjust your learning outcomes for next time. But based on what they tell you is the most significant, that can tell you a lot about what they learned and what worked. And then based on what questions they have, you'll know whether, they now understand what is a scholarly article, whether or not they got that like key content. So that can be really helpful for you, again, in just giving you that snapshot of whether students got what you were hoping they would get. And the next one is similar, the Muddiest Point. And this one, it's super important to follow up on. All of these, give you an opportunity to correct student understanding or to fill in gaps. But this one in particular is meant just to find out the gaps. So ask students at the end of the session, what was the muddiest point for you today? And then based on what they tell you, and this can be really short, you can give them an index card to respond. You can ask them for, like one sentence, two sentences. This takes very little time, very little effort in the classroom. But the important thing is then taking it back to your desk and reading through it to see, all right, do we have like 3 categories of muddiest point that I need to follow up on next time? Is there one big thing that stands out that I'm going to focus on for my lecture in the next session? It can give you a lot of information that will lead you to your next class for sure. The next one, I like this one as an assessment tool, the defining features matrix. So I'm actually gonna talk through like what these terms mean because we're going meta. So the defining features matrix gives you an opportunity to give students like 3 different ideas. Tell them here are like 3 big ideas that we talked about in class today. Can you choose what are the defining features of this? So the example I've given you here is specific for our topic about classroom assessment. So I have 3 categories of assessments. We have CATs in the first column, so classroom assessment techniques. Second column is class evaluations. So end of semester, when students evaluate you as a teacher and your course as a course, that's what we're talking about there in that column. And then the final column is for final exams. So students at the end of your course take an exam. I'd love for you to think about whether each of these categories, each of these columns of a different assessment technique or a different assessment strategy, is that student-centered? Is it formative? Is it summative? Does it give you an interim or a benchmark? So if we were doing this in a classroom, I would hand you this little table yourselves to each of you, and then have you check in each box. But we're just going to look at it and discuss through it today in this online session. So CATs, are they student-centered? Yes, that's what I told you. Are they formative? Yes. Are they summative? No, because they don't give you like an end of semester picture of what's going on. Do they give you an interim or a benchmark? Maybe, depending on what kind of a classroom assessment technique you're using. Class evaluations are not student-centered at all. They're totally teacher-centered because they're telling you something about you and your teaching and your class. They're not telling you much about students at all. They're not formative because they don't happen at the right time in the semester for you to get feedback. They're just summative at the end of the semester to tell you, here's what was good and bad about you and about your class. And they don't really give you any, I guess they do give you some benchmarking information if it like is compared to other people in your department. And then final exams, depending on how they're designed, they may be student-centered. They are not formative, they are summative because they're end of semester. And they could give students a benchmark in terms of how they're doing compared to other students, but probably not. That's not always like a feature of a final exam. So that is my example of a defining features matrix. You could do that with like 3 different ideas that you're presenting. If you have 3 different theories that students are supposed to apply to a text, and then ask them to, you know, check which features they see in these theories, or give them 3 different major thinkers in a discipline. If you've read something by, you know, 3 different people, and then have them match the ideas. So that's just a quick way to look and see, like, did they get the big idea? Are they understanding the main thing that you want them to understand? All right, and the next one, I'm going to have you take 3 minutes and do this one. I really like to do a transfer and apply at the end of a class session because it has students do what we really want them to do, which is take whatever ideas they've been exploring or hearing about, reading about, and then think about how that's going to impact like their final assignment, or how that's going to impact what they're working on next. So for you all, I would like you to take 3 minutes and first write down anything that has been useful, interesting, intriguing that we've talked about so far today in our 35 minutes. And then after you've written down the stuff that is sort of still swirling in your brain that you're thinking about, then write down how this could be applicable for you in your teaching. So I'll be quiet for 3 minutes and give you a chance to do that. Okay, so that was 3 minutes. And as you can tell, that's plenty of time really to think about what's useful and what you might use in the future. So if you're using this in a class session with students, as I said, this might be write down possible applications for your final project, or write down possible applications for your future work. Like if this is sort of like a career-oriented thing, this gives students a chance to do that metacognition and think about what they've learned and how they've learned it, and then how it's going to be useful to them, which is a really good way to cement the learning and help them think about their own next steps. So for you all, in terms of applications for your teaching, one place you might use this is in a lesson plan. So can we, well, I'll put the link for the lesson planning template in the chat. So if you take a look at that lesson plan template, you'll see that what we suggested for a class session is a learning activity, which might be lecture, discussion, I think pair share in there, and then a comprehension check. So any of these classroom assessment techniques could work as a comprehension check. To you could try out a Muddiest Point to see if students get what you're talking about. You can try out transfer and apply to see if students are on track. And so that's where this fits in to that lesson planning template. So, you know, in a 75-minute class, maybe you're planning in 2 learning activities and 2 checks for comprehension. And sometimes that might just be, you know, like a verbal check-in to say, what questions do you have right now? And other times it might be something a little more formal. And some of these you might collect and like take with you, like the Muddiest Point. You definitely want to take that with you and look over it to help you prepare for your next class. For transfer and apply, that's something, you know, you really want students to probably take away. And so in terms of your own check-in and assessment to see like, did that work out? You might just be sort of asking for a few examples. So did anyone have an application that you want to share, something that you've heard today or last time that you think, oh, I'm going to try this, I'm going to do this?
I would like to definitely try asking the survey question about where their their background knowledge, or assess where their understanding versus the technique I'm using right now is just giving them extra credit quizzes and encouraging them to take it so I can get that feedback and see how they're doing. But sometimes I feel like maybe they just randomly answer the questions. And so I'm not really getting a good picture of what they're understanding or not understanding. So I like the idea of just laying out the question, even if it's like a Likert scale that says, I understand, say, bioenergetics. I feel very comfortable that I understand the concepts behind bioenergetics, on a scale of don't understand at all to greatly understand. I feel like I could definitely apply that in my class and actually get more information from it compared to the way I'm doing it now.
Great. I'm glad to hear that. And I mean, it is obviously it's self-reporting, saying like, yes, I know this, I'm very confident with this. But if it's just a starting point for you to know like what, you know, what students feel like they know so far, you know, it's still useful information for sure.
Definitely.
I think for me, the big thing that I was thinking about is the group roles, specifically because last week I had said that one of my big issues is in one of my courses is having one student who is very over participatory and then 19 students who are under participatory, and having the group roles when we do the breakout sessions will make it so that everyone has a task that they have to participate in, but also to have them switch it up. So each time we're hearing from different people, and each time students get to try out a different task within their group.
Yeah, and that should help with the learning the content, right? Because everybody's like participating in a different way, but also just learning some like group role kind of stuff. Because some of us need to learn to listen in classes, and some of us need to learn how to speak up. So I think there'll be multiple benefits from that. That's great. Okay, well, thank you for sharing some of your thoughts there. This is the book that we've referenced, and thank you to Miranda who shared a nice website that has some selections from it. And from here, we're here for questions, discussion, any other ideas that you have. Assessment techniques you've tried, active learning strategies that you like to use, we're open to discuss.
And I put in the chat, I just wanted to say I put in the chat, but our Google folder also has 2 documents that I put in that have a pretty long list of active learning techniques. One of them has 226 listed there, so I promise you can find one that will work for your class. And then the other document is specifically about using active learning in larger sections.
One of the questions that I did have, if we did want to do something like the minute paper, right? I know we could possibly like put a give out note cards, right, that they could return back to us, but what would be the best way if we wanted to have them be able to submit it digitally so we're not having to use so much paper? Is there a good place or a good website or program to use where students can like post this stuff without it being like able to be seen by their classmates and stuff, like a discussion board where it's public?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. I mean, you could just go real basic and have them email you, say, like put your email up on the board and say, send me 2 sentences by email. You could make it collaborative and use something like a Jamboard. Have any of you used a Jamboard before? It's a Google tool. Let me put it in the chat. You don't have to put your name on a Jamboard. So if you wanted to like put this up in a classroom, like um put it like on your projector and give students the link, then they could all like write a little note and everybody would see everybody's notes, but they don't have to put their names on them unless they want to. So that could be kind of a fun way to do that. That would be like semi-collaborative, but it wouldn't out anybody like I don't know stuff.
Okay, thank you.
You can do it in different other ways too. I mean, you can build it as a like a Google form if you want it to be completely anonymous, and you can build it as like a quiz in Web Campus if you don't want them to have to use like another technology. I find that Google Forms is really easy though. If you want to use it in your class, something that I discovered last year was called Mentimeter, and it allows kind of real-time polling or students to submit an answer to a question, and then you can, as the presenter, you can show all of the responses as they're coming in. So if you want your students to see, what everybody else is finding as like the muddiest point, or if you want to build in like that Likert scale, if you're not using clickers in your class, this is like a way to kind of replicate that. The only limitation of this is that if you're using the free version, you can only have, I think, 3 of their different slides. So if you wanted to incorporate that into a larger, use it multiple times, you will either have to upgrade or create multiple presentations, or think really critically about what are the most important ways for students to interact. What's the information that you need, and how are you going to use that information in your class?
What are some good techniques to help a student who's struggling, when you have a student who's struggling a lot more than the rest of the class? Because I have one when I give like short writing assignments and that kind of, or pair work discussions, no matter what it is. I have one student who I think is trying hard. I don't think it's not being checked out or anything, but when it's writing, it's, um, he'll get through maybe 2 sentences when everybody else has written a couple paragraphs, or when they're speaking, he's speaking, a lot less comfortable speaking than the person he's partnered with. And so I don't know, I mean, uh, you know, so what are some good things to do?
Well, I mean, I would say that if that student is writing 2 sentences, that's 2 sentences that they didn't write earlier. So it's still, even though some students might write 2 sentences or some students might write 2 pages, like they're still getting something out of that. I would also just check in with the student individually, because they're probably aware that they are also not, that they're having some difficulty in class, and they might be worried about bringing it up to you, or they might be feeling embarrassed or whatever it is. And so you can present it in a way of, hey, how's the class going for you? Are there ways that, like, what do you need to be successful in this class? Because it might just be fine. It might be that they're writing those 2 sentences and those are two great sentences for them. They may, ask if you could provide the prompts in advance of class, or if you are having them turn in something at the end of class, giving them extra time, or giving all students extra time that they can turn it in that evening, so that all of them have the opportunity to go home and think about it or work on it a little bit more. So these are all just ways that, again, it's more accessible for all students, but just in general, asking students what they need and going from there.
Yeah, and I think in that case, just asking an open-ended question like that is a good start. Like, I feel like my temptation would be like, let me recommend tutoring and like extra reading, or like, but just like sitting back a little bit and just asking, like, how are things going? Is there anything that I could do to help? Would probably be the best place to start. But then do have in mind, like, there are campus resources. So if they need like writing help, visit the writing center. There's tutoring help, there's coaching, there are resources.
And then also, again, going back to your learning outcome, what is it that you want students to get, to be learning? And the student might be achieving that in 2 sentences. I mean, we can talk about that more, Miranda. Probably not, but again, like, is the goal that they are writing 5 paragraphs at the end, like within that class period? Because that might not be a realistic standard, and that there are going to be different ways that all of our students are going to interact in our class, and that's fine.
Yeah, no, it's not. I mean, it's more I guess I was thinking about the broader point of, I can tell this is a student who's struggling more than the other students, right? So I like that idea of the open-ended question very much.
And that's also just like a good strategy at various points in the semester to, kind of get the anonymous read on your class. You can pass out index cards and ask, what's working well in the class? What suggestions would you have to improve the class? Because as Melissa mentioned, those end of course evaluations, well, they come at the wrong time. They are retroactive, like looking back at how we could have made the class better for a group of students that we won't have again. And so if there are small things that we can change, that we can get feedback from our students, about when the due date for an assignment is, or, ways that we can make the readings or the activities more accessible for them. If we ask them that open-ended question, at weeks 4 after they've had a couple of weeks to be in the class, if we ask them again at the midterm, and we don't have to make all those changes, but we can at least explain to our students why we are making some changes or why we're not making some changes.
Are there any other questions for our speakers? Okay, if if there's a question, I still suppose it's not too late to post it in the chat. But before we end today's session, I'd like to thank our presenters for sharing their time and expertise with us today. And also a big thank you for our participants for joining us. Before you guys all log off, please just take a few minutes to fill out this workshop survey. It's a feedback survey. I'll drop it in the chat. And I hope that everyone has a great rest of the day and a great holiday weekend.